Hello and welcome to The Global Story. Today, America and the war in Ukraine. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the United States joined much of the Western world in jumping to Kyiv's diplomatic defense. A raft of economic sanctions were followed by multiple aid packages, with President Biden promising the U.S. would not waver in its support.
We will not waver. We will not waver. I mean that. Our commitment to Ukraine will not weaken.
But more than 2.5 years into the war, support for the Ukrainian effort has waned in Washington. Despite a bipartisan deal struck in April to deliver $61 billion in aid and a so-called surge spend of $8 billion on military assistance in September, congressional disquiet has continued to grow. So as domestic frustration over immigration and the economy continue to dominate the election, what do we know about how Kamala Harris and Donald Trump would deal with the war in Ukraine? And what might a victory for either candidate mean for the conflict? Joining me are the BBC's Ukraine correspondent, James Waterhouse in Kyiv. Hi, James. How are you?
Hi, Sumi. Very well, thanks. Keeping warm on the roof here in Kyiv.
And from London, our news correspondent, Will Vernon, who has reported for the BBC from Ukraine, Russia, and from DC. Hi, Will.
Hi, Sumi. Nice to be here.
Well, let's start by looking at the picture in Washington, because it is clear here on the ground that the appetite for continued aid to Ukraine is starting to dwindle. And we should say, of course, that the U.S. has provided more than any other nation to Ukraine. Will, what do the numbers look like at this point? And what is the latest surge in support that President Biden said he was giving actually consist of?
So as you say, America is the largest single contributor of aid to Ukraine. Washington's contributed about $175 billion since the full-scale invasion started. But actually, if you look at things as a proportion of GDP, America is actually number 14 or 15 in the list of the largest backers. Obviously, the US has a huge GDP. When President Zelensky was on a visit to the US recently, President Biden announced $8 billion. He called it a surge in support. That is actually not new money. That is part of an earlier pot that was part of this big Ukraine aid bill granted in April this year. And we remember, don't we, those jubilant scenes on the floor of the House of Representatives when lawmakers were waving Ukrainian flags. And actually, it's worth remembering that a majority of Republican lawmakers actually voted against that bill. So this $8 billion is not new money. It's basically a reauthorization of that earlier $60 billion. And part of that will be given to the Ukrainian government to purchase arms. Some of it will be financial assistance to the government, but quite a lot of it will actually be spent at home in the US. So either purchasing weapons to be sent to Ukraine from US arms manufacturers or replenishing US stocks.
Well, you touched on this with the Republican opposition in that vote in Congress in April. Compared to the early days of the war, where you'd see these large aid packages to Ukraine sail through Congress, opposition has been building. Tell us more about what that's looked like.
Yeah, I mean, there's huge opposition to support for Ukraine amongst what we call the MAGA Republicans, right? Make America Great Again, the pro-Trump Republicans. We sometimes call them America First. They're skeptical in general of global alliances, but particularly in terms of support for Ukraine. And their argument is that billions of dollars shouldn't be sent overseas to fund wars in far-flung places when that money could be spent at home on things like strengthening border security on America's southern border. Ukraine's skeptic in chief is J.D. Vance, Trump's running mate, the vice presidential candidate. He isn't happy at all about sending more money to Ukraine. He says that the U.S. arms production industry can't keep up with the Russian one, which critics say is not only untrue, but also is a bit disingenuous to the industrious men and women working in the U.S. arms industry. And the ultimate argument from these America First Republicans is that the US should negotiate with Vladimir Putin bring an end to this war. But Ukraine and its supporters say that Vladimir Putin is not the kind of man that you can negotiate with in good faith. He's violated, they say, almost every international agreement in the book, from the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 to the UN Charter to the Minsk agreements. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on.
We'll get to the positions of each candidate later, but James, Will mentioned on this recent diplomatic trip that President Zelensky made to the U.S., to the United Nations, he then traveled to Washington, to the White House. He was presenting his so-called victory plan. What is in this victory plan?
This is a victory plan, a just peace, as he puts it, that he is presenting to his Western allies. Until the last few months, he had long demanded the complete withdrawal of Russian forces and for the country's borders to be restored to before Russia's campaign of aggression, which started 10 years ago. I think what's changed in that time is the American skepticism that Will references and the battlefield realities, in that Russia is not only not being forced backwards, it is taking more Ukrainian territory. And one of my favourite barometers is President Zelensky's face. He is a performer, relatively speaking, when you compare him to other world leaders. He is someone at ease in a press conference, but there have been moments in this war when he hasn't been able to hide his either shock, horror, or disappointment. And I've looked at his expressions during this diplomatic tour. He's not a happy man. He's not getting what he wants. And the reality here is that the outcome of this election, thousands of miles away, could well determine Ukraine's fate or future. And so this victory plan, it is thought, may well include territorial concession in exchange for security guarantees. And we're starting to see a lot of editorials in the media, a lot of experts, a lot of officials speculate that Ukraine may well want to, short of NATO membership, try and get some guarantees from Western allies to, get the weapons it needs to stop going backwards, to shore up the fault lines as they are, and perhaps be able to exist in the long term as a democratic country. But it's fraught with caveats. Would America be willing to station troops in Ukraine itself when the West has been so wary of direct confrontation with Russia? What he's also doing is asking for permission to use Western missiles on targets deep inside Russia, and that has not materialized. So I think we're seeing an incredibly anxious period politically and in a military sense as well, as we head towards the US presidential election.
James, you mentioned aspects of this plan are believed to be about changing momentum in this war. And certainly earlier in the year, there was a feeling among some analysts here in the US that the war was stagnating, that Ukraine was even losing territory, as you said. That did change a bit, at least the narrative did, at the start of August, with Ukraine's surprise incursion into Russian territory in the Kursk region. Has this tactic worked for Ukraine?
It's worked in the sense that it has allowed Ukraine to exchange hundreds more prisoners of war with Russia because of the troops it captured in this extraordinary incursion. But there are other two goals, arguably, to that Russian offensive. One was to draw Russian forces from elsewhere. It is thought tens of thousands have been redeployed in the months since, but not to enough of an extent to slow in any way their advances in eastern Ukraine. I'll touch on that in a second, but the third goal was to potentially use it as political leverage, as a bargaining chip for any kind of peace negotiation. And what is happening now is we're seeing that redeployment of Russian troops where they are nibbling back to an extent where Russia has recaptured several settlements. And if Ukraine is unable to keep hold of this territory, then this operation would have almost been for nothing, apart from those prisoners of war exchanges. If we look at the east, it's interesting. We're seeing Russia really punch through with localized attacks in several areas where they continue to use their size in terms of numbers of troops, in terms of depth of resources, to punch through Ukrainian defenses. A confrontational war does not suit the smaller fighter, and Ukraine has always been that. And we've talked about that delay in American support earlier this year with disagreements in the US Congress. That directly caused Ukraine to lose ground, notably a town called Avdiivka, which, in the words of some officers there, should never have fallen. Because troops there ran out of ammunition and equipment, they lost it. And Russia has crucially not stopped there. And there are real concerns that there could be, I don't want to say domino effect, but there are certainly eastern Ukrainian cities sitting very nervously at the moment as Russian forces continue to erode Ukrainian territory.
Is there a sense that Ukraine rushing forces and equipment and resources to this incursion into the Kursk region, that has in a way come at the expense of the Eastern Front, where Ukrainians, as you said, are fighting very hard as Russians are pushing through and punching through those lines?
Yeah, I mean, it was a roll of the dice for Ukraine, no doubt about that. We were there in Sumy watching these guys go back and forth, and in the words of one critic we spoke to in eastern Ukraine, it certainly seemed like a sugar rush offensive where there was a big injection of morale, and we saw, certainly elite fighters. These weren't conscripts, these weren't volunteers, these were Ukraine's most professional soldiers using sophisticated pieces of Western kit. They have suffered losses in this operation, and so Ukraine will be wanting a return from that, whereas, you're seeing these buckling defensive lines in the east. So it's an incredibly difficult situation. We talked about a confrontational war. You're seeing Ukraine trying to shake things up as much as possible, given the geopolitical difficulties. But we must be careful to not get caught up in the geopolitics of this, because what is happening domestically is Ukraine continually trying to mobilize enough men to sustain its fight. And that is an incredibly sensitive issue politically. There are men petrified of being called up and finding themselves on the front lines. And that is the stage of the war we are at, where it is about increasingly a question of who loses first. Any talk of victory has been shelved.
I do want to look now at the approaches of each candidate and what they might do in terms of foreign policy. Well, if we start with Kamala Harris, she has been vocally very supportive of Ukraine, but she's not talked a lot about it on the campaign trail. Is it safe to assume that she would take a similar stance to President Biden going forward?
I think it is, yeah. I think if she wins the election, we won't see any change whatsoever in Ukraine policy from the White House. She's spoken many times about her support for Ukraine.
As I have made clear on our 6 previous meetings and throughout Putin's brutal aggression and war against Ukraine, my support for the people of Ukraine is unwavering.
She also, by the way, likes to talk about how she was in Munich meeting President Zelensky in February 2022, just a few days before the election. And she said that at that meeting, she shared intelligence with Mr. Zelensky and then set off on a kind of tour to gather together an anti-Russia coalition of countries after that. But actually, Ukrainian officials tell a slightly different story of what happened at that meeting. They say that President Zelensky asked for 2 things from Ms. Harris in Munich. One, that the US apply harsh preemptive sanctions against Russia to try and deter it from sending troops over the border. And the other thing was that America flood Ukraine with weapons. According to Ukrainian officials, Kamala Harris said no to both those requests. We don't know how much of it is true, but what is true is that Washington has been quite slow, a lot of people would say, to give Ukraine the weapons it needs to fight off the Russians. At the beginning of the war, there was quite a lot of caution in terms of sending a lot of weapons from the get-go. There was concern in the White House that some sort of escalation might follow, that this might provoke President Putin, and Ukraine and its supporters say that that fear persists. And there is still too much, as they would see it, concern in the White House that President Putin might escalate this conflict. It might lead to some sort of direct military confrontation between America and Russia, and that the Kremlin uses that fear.
We've heard Kamala Harris on the campaign trail and during the presidential debate use this quip, Putin would be sitting in Kyiv right now if Donald Trump were still president. Will, what about Donald Trump, the former president? How has he talked about President Zelensky?
Well, apparently he doesn't like him. Of course, we remember Trump's first impeachment back in 2019 that resulted from a phone call with President Zelensky in which allegedly Mr. Trump put pressure on Mr. Zelensky to open an investigation into the Biden family. That could be one reason. But also President Trump, former President Trump, has spoken very warmly of Vladimir Putin.
And so we have a very good relationship. And I also have a very good relationship, as you know, with President Putin. And I think if we win, I think we're going to get it resolved very quickly.
One thing I've noticed in the last few months at his rallies, Donald Trump has started using this phrase, Ukraine is gone.
It's sad they just don't know what to do because Ukraine is gone. It's not Ukraine anymore.
What we think he means is that Russia has essentially already won this war, or will. Why bother continuing to help the Ukrainians? We know that President Trump is very skeptic of NATO. He said earlier this year, didn't he, that if some NATO allies don't pay up, as he would see it, don't contribute sufficient amounts to the alliance, to the defense of the alliance, then Moscow can, quote, do whatever the hell they want with those countries. And that caused a lot of shock and concern right across Europe and right across NATO. But in terms of the Ukraine war more generally, I think, it's clear what Mr. Trump's position is in terms of what he says at his rallies. He says that this would never have happened on my watch, and that he says that he would bring the war to an end within 24 hours if he wins the election. Now, that, of course, gave birth to a lot of speculation about whether Donald Trump could leverage US aid to Ukraine to try and force the Ukrainians into some sort of ugly peace, some sort of deal that was bad for Ukraine that would end up ceding Ukrainian territory to Russia.
Yeah, I mean, I think many Ukrainians, including President Zelensky, would have an issue with Donald Trump's claim that Ukraine is demolished now and it should have made concessions before the war to prevent this from happening. It is true the country has lost an extraordinary number of soldiers and civilians at the hands of this full-scale invasion by Moscow. But what they would argue is that and to quote a sentiment I heard in Kherson, this southern city, which was, captured by the Russians early on, it was liberated, but it's been constantly shelled and attacked by drones since. But what people who live under those kind of attacks tell you is this is still better than being occupied. I am still sitting in a country where the democratically elected president is still in power. Now, this is a country under martial law. It is still holding its ground, but as Will alluded to, the West, the US, has always reacted to what Ukraine has done. There was a huge delay in the help before the war, and then, despite predictions Kyiv would fall in days, it didn't. Now, despite notable successes in 2022, the problem for Ukraine, and I've said this before, is that this is a story of survival. The problem for it is that this story is not over. While we are in a phase of the war where, with the upcoming US election, there really is a notable fork in the road now. But beyond that, it's really hard to see where Ukraine goes from here.
President Zelensky has made a point of meeting both candidates, including the Vice President Kamala Harris in her capacity as Vice President, but of course she is also the candidate. But, he also made a few faux pas in his trip to the U.S. recently. He visited an ammunition factory in Pennsylvania, and he was seen alongside the Pennsylvania governor, Josh Shapiro, who is, of course, a big surrogate for the Democrats for Kamala Harris. Well, could this be problematic going forward in terms of support among Republicans in particular?
I think it could. And, this visit didn't go well. I mean, if we cast our minds back 2 years ago to that first visit by President Zelensky, you had billions of dollars of pledges being made. You had, the great and the good of American politics clamoring to meet President Zelensky's standing ovations. This time round, Mr. Zelensky didn't even meet the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, during that visit. And that political blunder that you mentioned, the visit to the munitions factory, not only was it in President Biden's hometown of Scranton, but it was in Pennsylvania, right, which is the swingiest and the keyest of the key swing states, right? Those 7 states that will essentially decide the U.S. election. So furious reaction from Republicans who accuse Mr. Zelensky of meddling in internal affairs and of clear favoritism. J.D. Vance, President Zelensky made some comments about him as well to a journalist during that visit. He said that he was, quote, too radical. On top of all that, President Zelensky didn't get the main prize that he was hoping he could maybe clinch during that visit, and that is permission from the Americans, as we've discussed, to use Western-supplied long-range missiles to hit targets inside Russia. So difficult to see any significant achievements at all, really, from that visit.
James, how pivotal do you think U.S. backing for Ukraine is continued going forward if you look at support from other Western allies in Europe?
Well, it's the US and the US alone that can give Ukraine the military supplies necessary to fight this war. We've seen with that delayed support earlier this year just how costly it is for Ukraine. We've seen admissions from the European Union that they've missed artillery shell manufacturing targets. They've admitted, European allies, that they can't plug the gap left by America. And because of America's size, its might, its political influence, other allies look to Washington for political cover when it comes to making their own individual pledges on issues such as supplying tanks or long-range missiles or fighter jets of their own. And so, without the weight of America behind Ukraine, Ukraine will always keep fighting. But things could go south very quickly.
If there were a situation where the U.S. were to drastically reduce or withdraw support completely, how long could Ukraine continue fighting?
That is incredibly difficult. That's a difficult one, Sumi. I think it won't be the turning off of taps. There are pledges of billions of dollars that will continue to be delivered. And you see these supplies come across the borders of Poland and elsewhere that go straight to the front lines. But, we could be talking about, it's typically weeks and months where we start to see notable Russian advances when Ukraine runs out of ammunition. For example, Ukraine is already out-equipped by the Russians. The ratios were once 7-1, I think, when it came to ammunition and artillery shells. It's gone down, but there is still a deficit as far as Ukraine is concerned. This is a teetering front line. If it was to go beyond that, if we saw cities like Pokrovsk, like Konstantinivka, like Kupiansk across the east fall into Russian control, then you have major routes that become occupied. And then Ukraine has a real problem. It's backtracking and once again having to prioritize key cities like Kyiv. And it's all of a sudden feeling very 2022 again.
Well, we also have to say that Russia has allies, of course, in its war as well. North Korea, China, Iran have all been accused of assisting Moscow militarily. How much is that something that could be influenced by who the next president of the U.S. is?
In terms of what US government agencies are doing, they are taking more action against countries like China, Iran, North Korea, these countries that in one way or another, directly or indirectly, are supporting, right, or somehow assisting Russia in the war in Ukraine. So I think that if Kamala Harris wins the election, that certainly will continue those increased efforts by US government agencies to take action against those countries. But it's difficult to predict what exactly Trump would do in office. He tends to change his mind quite a lot. But we should remember that Donald Trump is essentially an isolationist, right? He is very skeptical of global alliances, especially NATO. Kamala Harris is committed to global alliances. So I think the stakes are incredibly high in this election.
Really interesting discussion. James, Will, thank you both so much.
Thanks, Sumi.
Thanks, Sumi.
If you want more episodes of The Global Story, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Each day, we dive deep into a single issue, bringing you analysis from our correspondents around the world. Subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.